Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the webinar, The Public Procurement in Times of COVID-19, with a special guest from United States, from Rehoboth Beach, Professor Christopher Yukins from George Washington University. Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us, and we really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Before we start, my name is Michał Kania. I have the great privilege to be the host of today's meeting. Thank you very much for this. And before we start, the organizer of our meeting is Pro Silesia Association. And we've got Professor Wiesław Banyś, who is the president of the management board of the Pro Silesia Association. Professor was also our rector, is a previous rector of University of Silesia. Professor, if I can ask you for a few words to us and opening the session.
Thank you, Michał. Just a few words. First, good morning, Professor Yukins. It's a great pleasure to have you with us on behalf of our Business Universities Local Authorities Association. I would like to thank you for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you.
Good morning also to all our participants from overseas, and good afternoon our European participants. We welcome you all very, very warmly. Just a few words about our association. It has been created near 3 years ago, and our first objective is to bring together representatives from these three sectors: business, industry, universities of every kind, comprehensive universities, but also technical and medical universities and local authorities. In particular, the authorities of our Silesian metropolitan area. We promote innovation ecosystems in our region, in Poland and in Europe, by trying to boost shared development strategies between regions, and in particular those with a similar theme in the smart specialization strategy, in order to encourage discoveries, innovations, and inventions. Our European experience shows that innovation is mainly driven by strong territorial innovation ecosystems with universities of excellence at their heart. And naturally, we all have to cope with public procurements. Dear friends, I wish you all a very good webinar. Good luck. Michał, it's up to you, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for this. So our friends and colleagues are still joining us, also from Warsaw, practitioners, welcome. For those of you who didn't have the chance to meet Professor Yukins in person, just information about Professor. So his CV is enormous, and I took just the basic facts about his professional career. So Professor Christopher Yukins is a thought leader in global public procurement. He serves also as a co-director of the government procurement law program at the George Washington University Law School, which I used to call the public procurement heaven. I was in this heaven last year. It was really fantastic experience for me, and thanks to Professor Yukins, I had this opportunity to join this great program. Professor Yukins also teaches contract formations and other issues related to public procurement and government contracting. He's also a great practitioner. He's currently counsel to the firm of Arnold and Porter. What is really very important, and I think that the picture behind Professor is very adequate to this. Professor Yukins is building bridges between scholars and practitioners dealing with public procurement around the globe. And in my opinion, this is our great chance as a Silesia region to learn from Professor Yukins all of these new methods, very important for us, how to develop the public sphere, how to use and implement the fourth industrial revolution, innovation things, also climate changes, which are a very big issue here in the Silesia region. So it's our great pleasure to cooperate with Professor Christopher Yukins. Professor Yukins also has a blog at the Public Procurement International, and in my opinion, this is the most important place for international community related to public procurement. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Professor Yukins conducted several webinars related to public procurement and COVID-19. It was the place where we can learn about the current situation in all of the regions around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in United States. We learned a lot from these webinars, and it was a great opportunity for us to understand the mechanisms, challenges, and also further steps related to public procurement and COVID-19. And today we would like to discuss these things connected with next steps, with challenges, global challenges also, and Professor Yukins' thoughts about this. We would like to welcome very warmly also Professor Gabriela Racca, who joined us at the moment from Italy. I would like also say a few words about the Silesia, because also from people from abroad, from colleagues and friends from abroad, and also from other parts of Poland, the short information, because you could see information about Silesia, University of Silesia, Association Pro Silesia. So Silesia, this is the region in southern Poland. We've got here 4.5 million citizens and 71 cities. This is still the center of industrial Poland, and it was the situation like that in the history. We have a great potential. We have great people here. We have great universities. I think that we can really achieve lots of very interesting and good things here. But I think that we need to think in a different way about public procurement, public-private partnerships, the challenges that we've got in the front of us. And this is one of the reasons why the cooperation with Professor Yukins, George Washington University is so important. The heart, I hope also the mind of this region is University of Silesia in Katowice. This is the place that we would like to create as a very influential place for the rest of Poland and the rest of this region. Also, the Pro Silesia Association is very important for us. Professor Wiesław Banyś, who is the president of the management board, is a great supporter of the new things here. He's a leader in this environment. He's trying to push the things further related to public procurement, public-private partnership. So this is Silesia region. I hope I will have the opportunity to welcome you here one day. Why we decided to create this meeting, this webinar with Professor Yukins? So I think that we shared the opinion that we can learn something, some lessons from for procurement from COVID-19 pandemic. It was, of course, very dramatic time for all of us, but I think that we should see some opportunities also how we can deal in the future with situation like that. There is also the question of potential reforms. I think I can speak here on behalf of Silesia region. I think we need these reforms. Right now, we are using only a small amount of numbers of provisions foreseen in public procurement regulation and also in European Union directive. We still are using only the very simple and basic legal instruments. And I think that we've got the chance and potential here to use many more instruments, like, for example, negotiations, innovative partnership, also, of course, market research, and other things connected to climate changes, social public procurement, many more. So I think it may be the time to start the potential reforms on the base on the lessons that we learned from COVID-19. And we've also got here, and welcome very warmly, some academics, and maybe we can try to show you some research topics related to COVID-19. The schedule of our meeting is, I would like to ask 3-4 questions, Professor Yukins. And then I would like to give the floor to our audience, to the Q&A session. Professor Yukins, do you want to add something at the beginning of our meeting?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really very appreciative of this, and I really enjoyed my time coming to visit Silesia. I think it's a very special part of the world, and thank you for that. I want to welcome, besides Professor Rocca, and who has been a co-editor with me on a couple books. I'm going to ask her to talk with me about our book a little bit later on a later slide. And also Halima Najib Locke is with us. She's a staffer in the House of Representatives and a former student. We'll be talking about one of the initiatives that she has a keen interest in, which is what we refer to, and we have a chapter on this in the book. It's called, we refer to it colloquially as Amazon.gov, which is opening up commercial electronic marketplaces like Amazon to government buyers, so that a federal official will be able to buy directly from Amazon. The General Services Administration, which is our main centralized purchasing agency, has an initiative to do that, to open that up. They estimate the value of those contracts to be about $6 billion. They estimate $6 billion in sales. I estimate, based on data that's been published, about $20 billion in sales. It'll be below the micro purchase threshold of $20,000. And there's an industry association has estimated that it'll be a $60 billion market. So it's a huge market opening up on our $500 billion federal procurement market. So that's an issue we'll be talking about, because it's an important corollary to what we've seen in the COVID-19 crisis. We're going to be having 2 days ago, we had a webinar on the Inspector General's crisis here. The Trump administration has dismissed 5 inspectors general, which is unprecedented from a historical standpoint. Inspectors general have been part of our government as an anti-corruption device in the agencies since 1978. And so we had a session, and I wanted to share with you, because you talked a lot, Mikhail, about reform. As an academic, I wanted to share with you what we're learning from the webinar structure, and from being able to do a lot of, so the Inspector General issue is very controversial. Trump supporters think that he's entitled to do it under the statute. He is, but Trump opponents think that it's a violation of established norms under the Inspector General Act for him to dismiss inspectors general because they're posing political risk to the administration. And we were able to put together a very detailed information compilation before the webinar. So this is for all the academics on the program we're putting together programs that are ostensibly politically controversial, but because we are academics in this medium, where you're not only having a webinar, it's not only having a lecture, but you can also have layers of information behind it, videos, historical documents, analyses. You can put it all up before, and that makes the reform effort much easier, because the denser it gets, the less controversial it is, because you're showing all the information. You're being transparent about the facts. It's a very interesting lesson from the COVID-19 crisis. It forced us into webinars, forced us into an electronic, and we had a meeting at the University of Warsaw, a few months ago, and there it was always two-dimensional. It's a speaker and the audience. But with this new dimension, the new internet, we're now able to put a lot more information in place, and it becomes less controversial. It becomes dense information being shared as efficiently as possible. It's a very interesting development.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
We'll have a session on the electronic marketplaces, hopefully at the end of the month. We are recruiting Jeff Kozis, who's the head of the centralized purchasing agency's policy section, to talk about Amazon.gov. And we will have professors from around the country, from Arizona State, North Carolina State, from Penn State, to talk about this new initiative in their supply chain, their private supply chain professors. So that's another thing we're getting. Not only bridging between countries, but we're bridging between disciplines. Historically, the private supply chain and public supply chain communities have been stovepiped. But with a webinar, with the internet, with this type of easy communication, we begin to pull them together. So for example, we'll be talking about the training that public buyers will need in order to use the new Amazon.gov. So really interesting developments are coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, because we're being forced in new directions in a very, very interesting way.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting also for us here in Poland, because we are just coming into the new stage of our public procurement regulation. We will have the new regulation coming into force on 1st January 2021, and we are also approaching the things connected with the electronic marketplace, and we believe that it can make things much, much easier, and this is also very interesting for us.
Yeah, I'm like, frankly getting to the point in the reform debates, I don't even advocate anymore. I see my job is to get as many facts forward as possible and to do that within a distilled way. But if I can get more facts out, then we can stop bickering about the advocacy. So,
Sure.
so you had a question, how is the public procurement market?
Yeah. So if I can just speak a little bit about the context, because during your great webinars, we heard a lot of stories that would be hard to believe before the pandemic. We heard the stories about the public authorities, the lack of cooperation between them, in fact, it resulting in a deficit of medical staff in the region most touched by the coronavirus. What we also observed was just the tremendous situation in which a very structured public procurement turned into a chaotic one. It was completely upside down. And my first general question is, we are very curious about your opinion. How has the public procurement market changed in the time of COVID-19 pandemic? What general challenges have there been to public procurement during this very dramatic time?
So I think what it really brought to the fore is an existential question for procurement, whether or not the public procurement function will survive. I think that's an open question right now. So to take a couple steps back, especially for people who are new to procurement, we always believed that much of the way the public procurement market works is because it's a buyer's market, that the government is able to aggregate so much demand that it becomes a buyer's market. And that's why the government, for example, can literally, historically, the government would post a notice up on a wall and say, I want to buy a car. Whereas if I posted a notice up on a wall saying I want to buy a car, I have no market power. None of the automobile dealers would come to me. The transaction would fail. The government could do it because they have so much demand that people watch what's up on the wall. So we thought that that really explained the way the government procurement market worked, that it was a buyer's market, and that's why we could have these special clunky procedures. And what emerged during the course of the pandemic is that, yeah, it was a buyer's market, but it was a buyer's market with a capital B. There was a market set up to support and to really to insulate the actual buyers, the procuring officials. And when things got really bad, they couldn't do anything. They weren't ready to go. So you saw, Mikhail, we had, for example, in New York City, they couldn't buy masks fast enough. And what New York City had to do was, we have a student named Tommy Hendricks. He's a former commando. He was trained at West Point. He was a commando for 10 years in the Green Beret. He's a very serious guy. And he's got an MBA from Columbia. He's a venture capitalist in New York. And he said, okay, you need masks. And he went out and bought masks using private money. He was using Rockefeller Foundation money to buy masks from criminals in Brooklyn and Western Long Island. And he had pictures. They had what they call proof of life pictures. It was the guy who had the mask would take a picture of himself with a box of masks and send it to Tommy, and Tommy would have to go out. and since Tommy had dealt with terrorists, he doesn't really mind. But this is rough work. And he was using private money because the public system couldn't respond fast enough. He had to buy masks. He didn't have to buy body bags. He had to buy body racks. He had to buy racks for the bodies that were accumulating in New York City. And he had to do that with private money because the public system, he was cooperating with the public system, but he had to do it with private money because the public system, once you had public money involved, then it didn't work. And we were getting questions, Mikhail, in the chat. Well, why would you do that? You're not a public official. And we had to say, well, New York City is founded early in the 17th century. Since that time, there's been a long history of cooperation between civil society and the city. In time of crisis, everything gets wrapped together and everybody cooperates. So we could do it because we have 400 years of cooperative history. It works. But in general, it would be way too dangerous to do something like that. So the public procurement systems were breaking down. That was the main lesson. And that creates questions about how to create a more resilient supply chain. And this is one of the paths, Mikhail, that lead us to Amazon.gov, because the private supply chains are going to be more resilient. Amazon thrived during the pandemic. If you wanted to get anything here in America, you bought it through Amazon. That was the way you couldn't get it anywhere else, but you could go to Amazon and you knew that the system would work, the logistical chain would work. If that chain had been open to the governments would have had less supply chain risk. So that caused a fundamental change in the procurement market or the way people think about procurement. It also made us think about, oh my God, now Amazon, the procurement hasn't completed yet with the centralized purchasing agency. So Amazon isn't open yet to federal purchasers, but that will happen in the next few months. It's very close. In fact, this webinar that we're doing at the end of the month, I have to be very careful how I structure it because there's likely to be a bid challenge once the award is made. And I said to Jeff Kozis, I said, I do not want to talk to you about any issues that could be the subject of a bid challenge. He said, yeah, that's right. Because we're that close, but we're not there yet. And so everybody was sort of looking over the trend. What's coming next? Could we use Amazon in this situation instead? And I think the answer is yes. And when that happens, when we start getting purchases directly through Amazon, and by the way, they're going to be limited below $20,000. Right now it's $20,000. It'll go down to $10,000 after the emergency. It'll probably go up to $25,000. That will include services, and the federal buyers will do everything they can to bypass the federal purchasers. The federal procuring officials are slowing down the purchase process, and people want to bypass them so they'll go directly to Amazon. The users will take control. And what you and I have been talking about for years as the agency problem, which is that the officials, the buying officials, are agents for the government principals, the users, for whoever we want to call the principal. The agents have always been so inefficient, and COVID-19 showed that clearly. And now the question is, will the agents be destroyed? Basically, will our discipline disappear potentially within your lifetime? It probably won't happen within my lifetime. It could happen within your lifetime. The entire discipline could disappear. That's a possibility.
Oh, it's very, very interesting. Thank you very much for this.
For the bad news.
Bad news, bad news. But still, there's the exploration of moon in front of us, so maybe we can think about some other things. But anticipating your question, in fact, yeah, sure.
Can we go back to the other questions that you had?
Of course.
The general challenges that were to public procurement during the pandemic, because those were really interesting too. Yeah. There was the supply availability. We're going to go back to these issues along the way, but the supply availability was a really obvious, huge issue. How can you get enough masks? How can you get enough respirators? And how you do that at a reasonable price and a reasonable quality. So access to supplies, quality, and price. I'm interested to hear from you about the Polish experience. I want to talk about just quickly about the South African experience, which is very interesting. Price, they saw price going crazy. They saw prices escalating really rapidly. So South Africa tried to impose price constraints. They tried to say prices that were set before the pandemic were going to be ceilings. And that was a very interesting experiment and very dangerous, I think, because it meant that South Africa was taking itself out of world markets because their purchasers couldn't go to the market prices.
Thank you very much. So you asked me about Poland, and in fact, this is the second question, because we observe the huge incoherence between the operations of particular countries, including Poland here, and the long-awaited activity of European Commission. So what we did here in Poland, the Polish legislator decided very quickly to exclude the whole public procurement regulation from purchases related to supplies and services concerning COVID-19. At the same time, the European Commission issued guidelines which were called to use of legal instrument foreseen in directive, in the classical directive. At the moment when the legislature decided to exclude the use of public procurement regimes, we observed many situations leading to complications concerning public purchases, such as buying damage or completely unusable items. I will use my power as a host.
Superpowers.
Yeah. So the question is, Are the current regulations related to public procurement sufficient during an emergency situation such as combating the COVID-19 pandemic, or should we treat it only as a barrier and a red tape monster, or are there maybe some benefits to using public procurement regimes even during this complicated time? We saw here some situations which were very complicated, and they were related to even central government bodies, in which there were questions about the quality of what we bought, the relations and other issues. And maybe we should use the public procurement regime and public procurement regulation to avoid situations like that. What is your opinion? I'm very curious about this. Do you think that this public procurement regulation that we've got is sufficient also for this situation, or should we treat it only as a problem, only as a barrier?
Let me talk about the American experience if I could. And I'm writing on some of this stuff for, Sue Arrowsmith is publishing a special edition of the Public Procurement Law Review, as you know. And she's also, I'm a co-editor on a book with her she's putting together of COVID-19 experiences. So talk about the American experience for a second. And it breaks down into separate pieces. And all of these pieces are, for the academics on the line, these are all potential areas of research. The first one is contract administration and the standardized terms. The American system has built up since the Revolutionary War, has built up a series of standardized contract administration terms. So we have, not only do we have a contract formation system that looks much like yours in Europe, we have a contract administration system that's highly standardized, and it allocates risks between the parties. Primarily, it allocates the risks of delay and liquidated damages, but to a certain extent, it allocates cost risks. So if you're incurring additional costs, it allocates those risks. Instead of just going in with a mess of force majeure, oh, this is force majeure, and then both parties have to figure out what that means. The clauses are, in essence, an elaboration on the force majeure doctrine. They're a clarification. So what you saw in the United States with regards to risks that were governed by these contract administration terms that have been developed over decades, sometimes over centuries, with regards to those terms, there was almost no dispute. It was amazing. They were just, everybody just sailed right through. No transaction costs, zero transaction costs, essentially. Everybody knew exactly what the risks were and dealt with it. And they cover those standardized clauses cover, for instance, things like epidemics. And declarations of emergency. There are gradations of emergency. There's epidemics. Are they broad epidemics? Are they localized? The clauses are very specific. They've been built up with a great deal. So the basic risks were covered. The hard part was covering new risks that are not anticipated by these standardized clauses. That was the hard part. And that's where there's still a lot of pushing and shoving going on. And I think the question, in some ways, yours is a trick question because you're asking about procurement regulations. The hardest part of what we had to deal with, and we're still dealing with, and Halima worked with me on this issue when she was on the House Armed Services Committee, is how we deal with resource allocation in a crisis. So if a nuclear weapon dropped on Warsaw tomorrow and you had devastation across Poland, and you had to take money out of procurement budgets across Poland, how would you do that in the contractual context that you have? Would it just be an executive action? Would it be a matter of modifying the contracts? That's what we're trying to figure out we have a statute that's passed very rapidly. It's passed in 3 days, a $2 trillion statute passed in 3 days. And it wrote a very rapid provision in there saying that the costs of keeping employees home in order to reduce the healthcare risk, those costs could be covered by existing contracts. And we're still trying to figure out what that means. The point I'm trying to get across is, in a time of a public crisis, can you draw on the procurement budgets, and do the procurement regulations have to make that possible? Do the procurement regulations have to be sophisticated enough to anticipate a reallocation of national resources in the time of a national crisis? And I think that's a really, really tough question. And to be frank, in Poland's history, you've gone through many, many much deeper crises inside your country. And so it's a real issue to think through. How can we set up a contractual structure in Poland so that we are better able to draw on the resources that are essentially stuck in little pockets all over the government, draw on those resources in a time of national crisis? That was very, very interesting. On your second question of treating public procurement regulations as a red tape monster, so I was thinking about this. When I was walking this morning, I pull up my iPhone and I pull up the slides. And I said, why did Mikhail put a big picture of the European Commission here next to this picture? I think the answer is that from an American perspective, I'd be frank, I could not for the life of me figuring out what the European Commission was doing. The world was going down the toilet really rapidly, and the European Commission was issuing modifications to regulations. The one goddamn thing that the European Commission had to do, which is buy emergency supplies, they screwed it up. Okay, so the Commission, and in the middle of all that, they went on vacation, and so from an American perspective, like we were talking about this morning, and Halim would be interested in this. We have a faculty meeting. After I get off this, we're going to have a Zoom faculty meeting where we're going to be talking about how to respond to the fact that protesters were attacked by troops in front of the White House on Monday of this week. And the professors, there are a lot of conservative professors who will oppose doing anything. A lot of the professors are like, from an American perspective, this is a crisis, do your job and do something. This is a crisis, do your job and do something. And the European Commission didn't do anything. They saw their role essentially as a regulatory role. And in that context, they raised the question, does a regulatory function divorced from an executive authority function, a regulatory function where you're just a regulator, but you're not really in charge of making sure that the people are okay, does that make any sense? And I think I'm a Democrat. I think our national experience right now is that the governor, the head of the country, Trump, loses legitimacy. The executive loses legitimacy if it does not take care of the people. He is not taking care of the people. The governors are taking care of the people. The European Commission did not take care of the people. And I think it lost a lot of legitimacy. And all we're left with is this regulatory function. And suddenly Brexit to me made more sense. I think Brexit is still insane from a British standpoint, but the tensions that created Brexit made more sense. So I think that, and this comes full circle, Mikhail, to my perspective on thinking about, as you're thinking about a contract administration structure, regulatory structure, not just to think about the allocation, the mundane day-to-day allocation of risks, but also be able to deal with an allocation of risks and responsibilities in the case of a crisis. Because the government, that's when the government's authority and legitimacy is most acutely at risk at times of crisis, to be able to deal with that.
Thank you very much for this. Yes, I think that the future of public procurement in Europe and also in Poland should be connected with the contract administration. It's a very important issue, and we still are avoiding this topic and just using the civil regulation, in fact, just called civil regulation. Thank you very much. It was very, very, very interesting. And my next question would be connected with the future, in fact, because of course we heard from some experts that the situation is similar to not even recession, but the big depression from 1930s in the United States. And at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the New Deal, in which, in fact, the public works played a very important role. In fact, the public procurement. And my question is, what do you think? Is there any special role for public procurement in the near future? Or maybe it is like that, as you mentioned before, that this is in fact the beginning of the end of our discipline.
And by the way, I think at the end of the day, that the folks inside the discipline will begin to realize how they have to reform themselves in order to survive. All COVID-19 did is made the dangers closer and more apparent. And we here survived a similar crisis at the turn of the century, the beginning of the century. There was a crisis about framework agreements because framework agreements were being misused. The crisis came to a head in the invasion of Iraq in late 2003. There were contractors who were enlisted to participate in the torture at the Abu Ghraib prison. and those contractors were working under framework agreements. And that really made everybody sit up and say, wow, these framework agreements are really being, those framework agreements were information technology, data processing. And so these guys were supposed to be data processing. Instead, they were helping with the torture. And that made everybody pay very close attention to reforming frameworks. And in many ways, the frameworks were reformed. There's much more compliance review now over the framework agreements because the agencies running the framework agreements knew they were under existential threat. And so they reformed. And I think the same thing will happen now, that the role of public procurement will be formed by the officials' knowledge that they're under existential threat, that they have to reform. And I think there are a couple of things a couple of immediate things that you can see coming out of that. One is that in our system, a much clearer definition of responsibility and autonomy in the state and federal systems. That in our system, the federal government was actually stealing supplies from the state government. The state government would get a supply of masks in from China, and the federal government would seize it under the Defense Production Act. Defense Production Act is basically communism come to America. It is a command and control economy. And however you would define a command and control economy, that's what the Defense Production Act is. And the federal government was using that power to seize supplies. And it made the states very, very angry. And so one of the things that I think we'll see happening is a supply chain respect, that there's going to be respect for the sovereigns, and that public procurement will change so that there's not the logistical streams are recognized as autonomous. And that happened during the COVID-19 crisis. During the COVID-19 crisis, the United Nations was transporting supplies through the United Nations system. And the United Nations system was autonomous. It was not subject to import controls or export controls. So that if you needed to move stuff to a developing nation where people were dying, you could do it through the United Nations system. It was a logistical chain that was legally autonomous. So I think that's going to be an important, the United Nations model could apply to the states here, and it could apply elsewhere, where you need in times of crisis to have an autonomous supply chain. There's going to be greater respect for that. That leads to the other question of how we're going to make sure in the future that we do have that access, that we do have the access that we desperately need, and whether or not we're going to be able to use other supply chains. And that's, so the other thing that we see opening now is the question of being able to hop between these supply chains. So you talked at the beginning about one of the problems that emerged during the pandemic is you really couldn't trust suppliers. Part of that is due to a lack of information. So will Poland be able to buy from an American logistical chain using suppliers that the United States has vetted? Will the United States be able to buy from a Polish supply chain? I think you're going to see that, because what you're really doing when you're buying from another countries or another procuring entity's supply chain is you're using their vetting. You're using their assessment of contractor qualification. I think that the Amazon phenomenon will strip away a lot of the technical assessment that's traditionally gone into procurement, because users will be able to buy so rapidly. They'll say, why should we go through a 5-week technical assessment when I can buy what I know what I want right off Amazon right now? And so the technical assessment will erode qualifications. Who are the vendors that are allowed to sell to government users through Amazon? Who are the vendors who are allowed to sell through the Polish supply chain that the Americans want to use? These issues of qualification will become much more important. Technical assessment will become less important, probably. That's an open question. And as qualification becomes more important, then sharing information between nations through a qualification system. And by the way, none of that is, one of the reasons I think public procurement will survive is none of that information is transparent regarding contractor qualification, vendor qualification. None of it's transparent in the private sector, except to the extent that you get consumer assessments. So the transparency of vendor information between systems is going to be an asset for public procurers. It's one of the reasons that public procurement, I think, will survive, because you'll have structured, credible information being passed and forth. Like here, the states were using the FBI. the states went immediately to the FBI and started asking the FBI for information about vendors so they could know whether or not the vendors are criminal or not. That's something that a private logistics provider has a very difficult time doing.
Thank you very much. I think it's another very interesting topic for our academics colleagues who can treat it as a research topic. And I would like to ask the last question because I would like to also open the discussion with our audience. But my impression is that the countries that are in the front of others in combating COVID-19, such as, for example, South Korea, have implemented successfully many innovative solutions. They use innovation, sometimes to tracking, sometimes to tracing. Also, people who could have the contact with other who were sick, but it helps a lot to understand where are the problems, where shall I go, where shouldn't I go, and things like this. And you wrote a great book together with Professor Gabriela Racca, who is today with us, about joint public procurement and innovation. And my question to you, if Professor Gabriela Racca would like also to comment something, it would be our great pleasure. Is there a special role for innovative public procurement in combating the COVID-19 pandemic, and also in the future, how important it will be for the future to use the innovative procurement? And I think we can start even to explain what this term innovative procurement mean.
Gabriela?
Good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Ciao.
I wasn't supposed to intervene, but I'm pleased to do it. But after Professor Yukins, so maybe I can face the question from the European point of view. But I would like to first let Professor Yukins to tell a word on how we managed to discuss innovation in the book. Okay, Professor Yukins, okay?
Sure.
Absolutely. So first I want to start with academic innovation, if I could, Mikhail. The book that we wrote, the book we edited, we didn't write it, we edited it. I was actually a child of innovation. It took me a while to figure this out, but many of the chapters were actually written in different languages originally, and the professors just popped them into Google Translate and delivered them. And I don't know if you know this, but Google Translate, it kind of belches in the middle, burps in the middle. And so I would get chapters all in English except one paragraph in a foreign language. And I'd say, aha, this is Google Translate. By the way, if we did this in Google Meet instead of Zoom, Google Meet right now has captioning, simultaneous captioning. And I've done some research on the Google chat rooms. There's serious discussion of taking those Google Meet captions and making them instantaneous translations. So I'm really confident within a year or two, we will be having this meeting in Google or in Zoom with simultaneous translation, so that a Polish visitor would be able to see what I'm saying in a reasonably accurate caption. So I think the innovation is moving very, very rapidly with regards to language. On the academic side, and you and I joked about this when I was on Katowice, about how difficult it is to deal with an academic bureaucracy. Our bureaucracy is so bad at the university level. So I was told originally that I couldn't use Zoom because the Russians might come into it. I said, well, actually, I have Russian guests. I don't care. And they said, no. So I said, okay, to hell with it. I just bought my own Zoom account. I was told, no, we can't have a blog. So I just bought my own blog. And now these innovations are being adopted. Like, we're actually going to have a webinar series for the fall done on Zoom, just like Yukins did it, because I did it. And what I've discovered in terms of innovation in the academy is we have set up a lot of rigorous mechanisms inside the academy to maintain quality, to make sure that the academy maintains a certain level of quality. It's committees who review everything. But those committees are the lowest common denominator. So if you take innovation and you pump it through a committee, the committee will destroy innovation. And that's really, really dangerous. And so I, as an academic, I've become a devotee of avoiding the committee process. So for example, you were a visiting scholar last year. As a Fulbright scholar, you were a visiting scholar. It cost a lot of money, and it was very hard on dear Barbara and everyone else to come over to America. It's very expensive. We could have virtual visiting scholars in our online platforms. It takes me 45 seconds to add a visiting scholar. Like somebody, I'm trying to get somebody with the European Commission to be a visiting scholar who's a virtual visiting scholar. It takes me 45 seconds. It is now taking 2 months through a committee process to approve something that I can do in 45 seconds. And that's crazy. We need to figure out a way within the academy to encourage innovation and then to harvest that innovation without crushing it in the committee process. Encourage innovation. That's what Google does. Google says to their people, take a day off, go develop this, come back. And when you come back, we want to integrate it into Google. That works. They're harvesting innovation. In the academy, we have to do the same thing. When Gabriele and I were working on this book, we were struggling with the definitions of what innovative procurement really is. And it can mean a lot of different things to different people. In the COVID-19 crisis, it means taking a new approach to procurement, like Tommy Hendricks, the guy I was telling you about in New York, who was using private funds to buy masks from criminals. That's innovative procurement. It also means, in the European context, it meant the launching a lot of little programs, but the European Commission we had a program on this, you saw it, a webinar. And the webinars, by the way, are all recorded on Public Procurement International. The European Commission launched a number of small projects, funded a number of small projects, like a Lithuanian project to check for COVID-19 in the sewer. And there was a big splash that the European Commission was funding innovation. But ironically, it's the same guy, but Tommy Hendricks is also a venture capitalist working in the government area. And he said the key to success in funding innovative procurement like that is figuring out how to carry it through the valley of death, how to carry it past the initial burst of innovation through the development and the commercialization. So the second and third years are the key, not the first year when you say, oh, we've got this big flashy program to check for COVID-19 in the sewer. It's how you do that in the second and third year, how you fund it. And Tommy's strategy, I think, is a good one, which is that you link those innovative projects to what he calls programs of record, which would be large weapon systems in the United States. That is something that we're just beginning to learn in COVID-19. The Americans are saying to the Europeans, we think you did the right thing by launching these innovative procurements. We think you did the right thing by funding innovation, but now you have to get them to the valley of death. And that's a procurement. It sounds like a funding question, but it's a procurement question because you have to figure out from a procurement standpoint how you get procurement money to these innovators, to these small enterprises that are bringing this innovation forward. Gabriela?
Thank you very much.
Okay, if I can, I share the idea of Professor Yukins, but from my point of view, innovation that we need, the innovation that we need is especially in the way we buy. So that's why we focused on joint procurement and joint cross-border procurement in Europe. That is an issue that we should talk about more deeply, because the joint procurement agreement during the COVID didn't work, and then we have to face the idea of how to reform it and how to use it, to apply it through central purchasing body. And so in my point is for answering or discussing a minute with what Professor Yukins said before. I think we have to work for having a public central purchasing body that works and becomes public Amazon, that will work and will become completely digitalized in order to permit to add the benefits of a portal like Amazon, but being public. That should be the European model and European efforts, that as we don't have Amazon in Europe as a company, a European company, but we have to build networks of central purchasing body. It would be hard, but that would be through digitalization we can work in this way. And this is the more important innovation we have to work on. while for the idea, the perspective of innovation procurement, innovation of buying innovation, and so buying innovative stuff also is important, not to leave it to single little municipality, little public administration. Innovation should be evaluated at a very large scale, in a way that we can share and say what is innovative. An innovative mask, for example, now is innovative for an Italian person who wears it as a Polish one, and so we can share it, and so have a kind of portals where we can find easily and buy easily all the innovative products, and give them a market, a cross-border market around Europe. That's the goal. So that's why we have to work a lot on Article 39 of the directive, to have also a portal for innovation, for making very easy to buy innovation, in order not to let innovation in the death of the valley of death, as Professor Yukins teaches us and explains us in the US experience. So there's a lot of work to do, and I will be pleased to discuss with you also in a further occasion, and happy to be involved also. It was not, I was not supposed to be. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Racca. Thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank you. Now I would like, yep.
Well, I just want to make out on Gabriela's point. What I never hear from you guys in Europe is you never discuss the comparative advantages you have to the Americans in moving forward. So, for instance, Gabriela's example of joint procurement, where you would have central purchasing bodies cooperating with each other across borders. Let's say Poland and Germany, the centralized purchasing bodies in one would be cooperating with the other. The difference between the United States and Europe is that by and large, your traditions of civil service are very different from ours. Your civil servants take the quality of their work much more seriously. In America, we actually have a phrase for it. It's called good enough for the government, good enough for government work. There's always sloppy work inside the government. And in Europe, in contrast, civil servants tend to take their work much more seriously. They tend to, there's a professionalism in the civil service oftentimes in Europe. So to talk about things like how we're going to approach innovative procurement in Europe, but then to also apply the cultural differences that you have in Europe, which I think are profound and which in many ways are a cultural advantage, a comparative advantage.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to ask our audience if you have any questions, comments, thoughts on our discussion. Please feel free to ask Professor Yukins. Are there any questions? You can use chat, or you can just ask question and you will be seen on the screen.
So is Halima with us still? Because I want to, Halima is particularly sensitive to the impact of this Amazon.gov initiative we've been talking about, the impact on small businesses, on small and medium-sized enterprises, because of her background. She worked on the Small Business Committee before. And that is an important issue that we're trying to work out here, how that will get sorted out. A question I have for you, Mikhail, is one of the things we've talked about in the COVID-19 crisis is that there is a convergence now of regulatory structure. So you, as a Pole, no longer hesitate to go right into the American regulatory structure because it's fundamentally so similar to the Polish regulatory structure. There are obviously going to be differences, and lawyers have to be careful when they're crossing borders, but the fundamental regulatory structures are very similar. So you can start to ask questions, meaningful questions across borders. One of the big questions is in dealing with Amazon is that it's actually interesting. Amazon, which is data-driven, the data that's going to be delivered to the federal government by Amazon is a much smaller stream than the government demands for itself. So Gabriela was talking about setting up an Amazon.gov in Europe. A dynamic purchasing system in Europe, by definition, if it's government run, is delivering a lot of data to the government. Amazon won't deliver that much data to the government in terms of what's being bought at what prices. Are the data requirements, the open data requirements in Europe, are they sufficiently sophisticated? Do the European directives create enough pressure on the procuring entities so that the procuring entities are demanding, whether or not it's internal or external, demanding the data they need to make effective management decisions.
So I think it's a very big problem because we are having now the problems with implementation of the procurement market in Poland. And I think there should be this transparency of all of the data that we will collect from the market. Right now, I think that we are doing the first step in Poland. We are trying to implement the e-procurement market under the EU threshold, and this is the biggest problem for us. And still, I think that this pressure of transparency is very, very important. We should implement it in the future. The problem that is really important will be the transportation of the data from one country to another. And what Professor Gabriela Raka said is very interesting, because I think that we can cooperate together with Hungary, Czech Republic, or Germany. And I think that we are not right now prepared to implement this in the practice, because this is the cultural also thing. And I think this is what we should work on in the future. And still, I think that there are many questions in relations between United States and Europe, because I think that in the future we shall create another bridges, as they were foreseen in TTIP Act, in fact. And my question is also if you think that there's a special time now for cooperation between US and Europe to share the information related to innovative procurement, innovation in procurement. Also, do you think that the future is bright for our cooperation between the United States and Europe in the near future?
Yeah, I would return to, for Halima and for the other Americans, we had a major political event in the last couple of days, was a statement released by General Mattis, who was he was the Secretary of Defense early in the Trump administration. And General Mattis is probably the most respected soldier in the United States. He's a very, very smart guy, and he's very, very honorable. He's bone deep honorable. And he made a statement that he attacked Trump. He said, we don't have, and it was extraordinary for him to do that because he was silent for several years. He attacked Trump and he said, Trump is not providing mature leadership, but we can do that. We have the ability in our society to respond. We have the structure, the civil structure, to respond effectively. And I think, to answer your question in our world, Mikhail, that this is the same argument I made when I was in Warsaw, at the University of Warsaw, which is that we have the structures. We have the academic structures. We have the bar structures. We have the governmental structures below the top levels. We have the structures for continued cooperation, and they work out practically. I think we have to be opportunistic and open. So, for example, we've been fighting for years about whether or not European vendors are getting fair access to the American subcentral market, to the state and local market. Well, the National Association of State Purchasing Officers sets up, it has a joint purchasing arrangement, a joint procurement arrangement that covers all the states. So all the states, for instance, in the Alabama can buy from an information technology that's run by Minnesota. It's about an $8 to $12 billion market every year. Alabama can buy from a procurement contract in Minnesota. There are no domestic content requirements built into those contracts, except for a few anomalous ones. And that means that Siemens can sell through those contracts, through Minnesota, into Alabama. So Siemens already has a way to sell at the subcentral level, in fact, to all the states, not just the states that are joining the government procurement agreement. So there's a practical solution. It means that all our discourse about opening up subcentral markets no longer takes place within the WTO, because the Trump administration is trying to destroy the WTO. Those discussions take place in a different context, in a private context, where we're looking, because the National Association of State Purchasing Officers gets a fee. They have an incentive to open up these lines of commerce. We have the solution. We can declare victory. We just have to declare it through a different channel. It means being creative about how we solve things, solve problems. Same thing with information technology accessibility. This laptop and this Zoom program, they are highly accessible to persons with disabilities because of rules that have been developed internationally. And the US regulators have adopted those international rules, opening up procurement, IT procurement, to enhance accessibility for persons with disability all over the world. That wasn't a central government initiative. That was an individual agency and was the disability community that pushed it forward. So we have to be opportunistic and we have to be open-minded.
Thank you very much, Professor. Are there any other questions to Professor Yukins? If not, I hope we will meet soon.
We will.
I think the innovation is very, very important, but still I think that just visiting all of these beautiful places in the United States were worth it to go there. I fully understand that 45 seconds will be much easier for all of us, but I still hope that we will meet soon personally. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I hope it was a very interesting session for you. Thank you and goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Gabriela.
Thank you very much, Professor Raka.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Professor Bamish. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.